adapt and adjust through this pandemic. And yes, we're moving into month 8, I guess, of this COVID pandemic, and it's affecting a lot, right? It's caused it's a global pandemic that has caused destabilization for just about everybody. So the things that we normally would be doing and relying upon have changed dramatically. When we talk about the holidays, generally the Thanksgiving through New Year's Day season, that is wrought with stress and anxiety and depression pre-COVID. So we have the effects of COVID, and we also have the stress of the holidays, which is sort of how this topic is relaying. So the holidays tend to bring with it feelings of a mixture, like joy, happiness, love. And then we also have stress, fatigue, being overwhelmed, and irritability maybe. So with all of that being the quote normal holiday season, the pandemic has forced us into doing all kinds of things in isolation, with fears of our health, contracting COVID. If we've had other coexisting conditions, we're at greater risk possibly for the effects of COVID. So all of these have been weighing on us. And when we look at traumatic events like a pandemic, we have the chronic and the critical. So the crisis was the first punch we felt with this pandemic. Now we're into the chronic phase, but it goes up and down as we hear more numbers about the COVID numbers going up. We get hit with another kind of crisis throughout the chronic. So it's both happening together, and it has a lot of impact for our emotional state.
Susan, how do you think we can remediate some of these issues?
Oh, yeah, I mean, to add what Star said, I think just overall consequences for people are that they felt more isolation. I think that's changing a little bit as people have become very creative and very adept at being able to connect with one another. But I certainly don't know that any of the anxiety and the worry has really changed. So I think you want to be able to try to, increase your connection with others, which again, I think people are doing, a lot better job with. We've kind of almost become professionals at, televiewing and, seeing people from, all different places on Zoom and on a lot of other different kinds of social media platforms. But you want to decrease isolation. I would really encourage people to try to be able to limit the amount of time they're really isolated from others. Certainly safety precautions need to be, upheld. Sometimes health issues can get in the way of actually in-person socializing, certainly with distancing and with, proper protective, equipment, masks and so on. But it's trying to be able to see people as much as we can in person, and being able to connect if we can't do that in person in other ways. Sleeping, eating properly. Sleep has been a big thing that's been disturbed throughout the pandemic. So I think we want to try to be able to make sure to pay attention to fundamentals like sleep and proper nutrition. Limit negative news. It's a lot of negative news going around now more than ever. We really want to, try to limit the amount of time that we're really looking at news media, period. But in particular, what we would kind of label as more negative news. Only look at news anyway, sources that are reputable, and really do acknowledge that there's so many different feelings that we're going to be experiencing around this event. And that, as Star had indicated as well, the holidays present their own unique set of experience, or kind of emotional and even physical experience as we move through them every year. So this year is going to be very different, but not so different in certain ways. The only thing I did want to say is a lot of times we get away from our feelings and our feelings overwhelm us. Sometimes we want to just recognize there's a differentiation between feelings and what is really factual. So our feelings are not straight out a fact. They're what we're experiencing in the moment, in our emotional state, and through what our thinking mind is telling us.
explain that a little bit more? I find that very interesting, that thing about the feelings not being factual, because, you know, in my experience, it's like you have to acknowledge your feelings and you have to let them go and recognize them. So, you know, how does that affect us, you know, in this whole COVID environment?
Well, I think the only thing is our feelings are feelings, right? So we all have them. We
Exactly.
absolutely need to acknowledge them and we need to speak about them. In particular, through these holiday season, throughout this event, we've been encouraging people to connect with others. Again, if not in person, certainly we haven't been able to do that. But feelings are a subjective experience of what has occurred or what's happened or history or what it is that's gone on in an immediacy or of a moment generally creates a feeling in us. But that's a subjective experience. So what sometimes we want to encourage people, and we take it as factual, right? Sometimes we
Oh,
misinterpret. A feeling is a feeling, it's never good or bad, but we can sometimes misinterpret it or believe it to be a factual experience or event. And it's really not, to the extent that it's not always based in fact, and it's a subjective experience rather than an objective experience. It's you know, it's we're not really able to kind of go through those feelings and experience them until we look through our thinking mind and be able to see other pieces that might be going along with whatever the precipitating event when they created a good deal of feelings in ourselves.
mhm.
So just paying attention to that sometimes a feeling may be a fact, but it's not always a fact.
Yeah, that makes sense. Now, I also know that during this pandemic, like people who have suffered the worst consequences are people who have already an illness, right? It's either diabetes, obesity, heart disease, or some type of respiratory disease. You know, I'm also a diabetes educator, so I know quite a little bit about diabetes. And I know that a lot of people, you know, who suffer chronic diseases, they already suffer from some type of depression, anxiety, because of the conditions that they have. And now on top of that, you know, COVID is here. It's a huge threat and it's a real threat. So what, Star, what can we tell these people? Like why, you know, obviously they have the biggest impact.
Yeah, and basically what we look at when we have kind of comorbidity, we have one or two or three or four or five things that layer upon each other. Sometimes it can be hard to find that inner resilience and some of the areas that we are doing pretty okay. So we want to remind people that the things they do to take care of their health are similar things that they will do to take care of their mental health. And so the mind-body connection is very powerful. And doing some small things are things that sort of during this pandemic we can focus on. They may seem like small, so sometimes we disregard them. Oh, it's not going to really matter. But if we do some of those consistent self-care, like Sue was mentioning, eating well, sleeping, doing all of the things that we take care of our body, our mental health tends to improve. And similarly, if we aren't taking care of our mental health, it can have an effect on our physical health. So it becomes a circular, you know, one affects the other. So we want to make sure we're taking care of both. And when physical illnesses are things that we have to manage, right? So we take that same approach with managing through this pandemic. You know, simple things that have created some positive changes actually through COVID. Many more people are outside walking than ever before. And just taking a 15-minute walk every day can have an impact on our mental health. But, you know, sometimes we would say, oh, it's just 15 minutes. What's that really going to do? But it does get us out into nature. It gets us moving our bodies. And so each of these things can kind of build upon the next.
Mm-hmm.
So in that way, I think doing some self check-ins that we would do for our physical health, we might do for our emotional health. One of the acronyms I like to use with people is the acronym HALT, which stands for hungry, angry, lonely, tired. So that's a self check-in, right? So sometimes we just have a bad feeling, getting back to that feeling conversation. We have a bad feeling, but we don't know what it is. So sometimes if we're hungry, we need to just take pause and feed ourselves. If we're tired, we need to rest. If we're lonely, we need to reach out to a friend. And sometimes that signal gets misconstrued. And when I'm really angry, I go and I reach for the Snickers bar, right? And it's sort of used as a check-in. Me too. So, you know, during this time when people are forced to kind of look at out of the box ways of doing things, their routines, managing is really what we're really talking about. So it can be the guiding, you know, along with the feelings that we have. They're the signals that let us, you know, alert us that we need to do something different or we need to pay attention.
Susan, are there other signals that we should be looking at? I mean, like the Snickers bar example is great, definitely. Sometimes we feel, you know, hungry and we ignore all the signals. Any other signals or tips that you would like to share with us, Susan?
I mean, I think if people generally are feeling senses of, you know, anxiety or sadness or, you know, kind of a low mood, they certainly want to pay attention for that. But I want to say that, you know, with populations that I think we're trying to speak of today, at least, is that when there is this comorbidity, in particular, if it is, you know, risk populations or existing populations that have significant healthcare issues, whether it is a chronic health issue, whether, you know, it is something that is, you know, something that someone's going to have to manage in an ongoing way, that can present its own unique set, right? Just generally of, as you had indicated, kind of sometimes isolation. Now people are needing, if there is a lot of comorbidity, people are at greater risk. So for very, you know, significant reasons, they're going to need to pull back from what might even be a more one-on-one interaction. And that in and of itself, because there's less connections, there might need to be more isolation. People might not be able to get outdoors and be able to, you know, take on different activities that are going to be in line with their own, you know, their own care or their own exercise. So I think that they're just going to have to people are going to have to tailor it for what they can do, what they're able to do, and enlist others as much as they can, whether it be other care providers, whether it be other loved ones, whether it be medical treatment, and that can be, you know, not just straight medical treatment, but, you know, behavioral health treatment as well. So if they are experiencing more significant feelings of isolation because they aren't able to have the involvements that, you know, because of their health issues, their medical conditions, then we want to try to be able to ramp it up in other ways and be able to have people have those psychosocial needs met in as creative and as diverse ways and as many of them as we can bring in, because there's a greater risk there.
Now, Esther, you mentioned walking, and I have to say it's one of my favorites because you definitely feel better after a walk. It's cheap. It doesn't cost you anything. You can do it by yourself or you can do it with friends or anybody. But the winter is coming. It's getting colder out. It's rainy. So the weather is not helping either. So what other types of exercise can we do, maybe indoors or, you know, by ourselves or with friends and family, that we can be safe and warm at the same time?
Yes, very, very important, right? How do we handle bringing in our wellness while we're faced with the changing outside weather? And I don't want to discourage people, and I do think this is going to be important, that the nature aspect of being outside does bring a lot of healing with it too, as well as different experience, just a change of the same four walls we might be looking at, right? So being outside, even just in sunlight where we have that absorption of vitamin D, you know, it's getting darker later, so we might have to make sure we're opening the blinds more. We can certainly take moment, and I have people sort of setting a little reminder on their phone every hour to do something that might fall into that wellness. So it might be just stretching, you know, like they do at the baseball games, the 7-inning stretch. It might be doing a deep breathing exercise for about 5 minutes. It might be just moving the body so that we're not so sedentary. And I certainly have noticed that myself when we're indoors in this pandemic, we're inside more, so we're more sedentary in other ways. But we can certainly do, if walking isn't something that's feasible because of health issues, we can do things from a seated position. You know, the Silver Seniors are known for doing chair aerobics. And that's something that we can always be doing. Just removing our bodies will create those endorphins. But we also don't want to move away from the also healing, slowed process that nature brings. So if it's sitting quietly and just watching a rain shower go by and being in that mindset of, I can't be outside right now, but I can appreciate the beauty of what's happening on sort of a macro level. And there's some relief in that as well.
Mm-hmm. You know, something I don't know if it's healthy or not, so please tell me. But you know, sometimes in a bad day, bad meaning is very cold outside or something like that, I like to just jump in the car and go to a park where I can see lots of green. And even if I stay in the car, you know, just look at the scenery. And I think that you said something about it, like just looking outside, like through the window, that's what I feel like, okay, you know, I'm breathing in here, I'm by myself, I'm kind of meditating. It feels better in a way, and it doesn't take a long time. It's not like I have to disappear from my home like for an hour. So do you think that's something other people could do? I mean, it helps me, I don't know.
Absolutely. You know, just being outside, they used to say, move a muscle, change a thought. Okay, so if I'm having a negative, you know, poor me experience, or I'm having a frustration about what used to be and what isn't now, or I'm having trouble accepting, or, you know, we're dealing with a lot of loss. We haven't even talked about loss of people that we love, but a lot of losses of what we've been used to being able to do. And so when we have that moment that you're describing, Sandra, which is just being part of the greater world, there's a spiritual experience of that. I don't mean spiritual religious, but spiritual of connection to nature. And that too helps interrupt the isolation that many of us have started to be feeling.
Yeah, and we definitely want to talk about, you know, the loss of loved ones, but also a little bit of the loss of freedom, right? Because with COVID, it's like, we're not allowed to touch people, we're not allowed to breathe, we're not allowed to show our faces anymore. So it's like so many new rules imposed on our lives from one minute to the next. It's overwhelming. But Susan, it looked like you wanted to say something else before we get into that.
Well, I mean, I think the mindfulness piece that you're really speaking to, of being present in whatever that moment is, whether you get in the car and you sit, or whether it's in your own backyard, or whether it's sitting and looking out a window, it's really that allows for a great opportunity to address any kinds of, mental health issues. Generally, being present, using meditation, using mindfulness. There's apps we can have on our phones. There's sites that we can go to that can kind of help teach us breathing exercises. There's loads and loads of them that people can do very, very simply, from, as Star said, from a chair without necessarily having to move. Better to move if we can, always better to keep the body in motion as much as we can. But we can do those. They're free, they're simple, they can be done anywhere. You can take them with you. You can take your information and your little bag of your meditation and breathing exercises in your mind with you anywhere. So I would really, encourage people to really lean on those and to practice. Mm-hmm. And they're not always easy initially, right? It's kind of, oh, this feels funny, and, meditating, and I'm doing this breathing exercise. It might feel awkward initially, but people will reap the rewards of it, and they'll see them very quickly. It's a real pretty good quick fix.
Now, Susan and Star, you're making me think of the opposite now. Like, yes, we know how good exercise is and this connection with nature and all of that, but I also know a lot of people who use the opposite, napping, sleeping. Is that as good? Like people say it works, but at the same time, I know that it could be a sign of depression. So when does something as harmless as napping and sleeping become a symptom of something very serious?
Oh, great question. And I think, we can all sort of relate to having a day where we just say, that's it. And we pull the covers up over our heads and say, I'm over this already, right? I'm done with this already. So a here and a there is not so concerning. If it becomes where it's really interrupting one's functioning, then napping sometimes can be used, or sleeping can be used as an escape. But it also can be used to interrupt our later sleep patterns at night. So we want to advise people, if they use napping, to stick to the 20 to 30 minute range of napping and not a 2-hour nap, so that we don't interrupt the natural circadian rhythm and then have sleep problems later. But I think also just sort of what seems reasonable. Is it an occasional, or is it becoming more patterned? Are there other symptoms maybe of depression that are showing up too, like overeating, isolating, suicidal thinking, not finding joy, and prolonged? So we're looking at something that's really becoming more habitual and longer term. But I also don't want to discourage people from using those self-check-ins, because we know ourselves pretty well. Most people know when they're kind of going outside of that realm, that range of their own baseline. Again, occasional, it's normal. We're all experiencing stress and anxiety at different levels, but everyone is having an effect of this. Donna, we want to add something, Sue?
Yeah, I think that just generally though in the winter, I mean, we know this with, the change in the day, daylight savings and so on, that people's circadian rhythms are just going to change. People overall, statistically, right, we know this, people usually sleep more hours often because there's more darkness throughout the winter months and so on. So that's not an unusual thing, that people might be picking up a little bit more sleep when we have the summer and there's many, many hours, 12, 14, 15 hours, even in daylight. It's very, very different. People will, use their circadian rhythms adapt. They're going to spend more time up. I think that people might want to just be able to look at the very fine line, and it really can be one, between, am I sleeping because it's dark out, it's really chilly out today, it feels really good in my bed, or it's just really a heavy day and it's weighing on me, or am I sleeping or taking up too much time in my bed, or in a more isolated state, right, away from others, maybe, sinking into something. Is that a means, or was that because I'm avoiding what might be going on in other areas of my emotional well-being or my psychological well-being? So if we're using it to kind of use the word escape, if we're using it as a more extensive way to avoid escape, and this is not just necessarily with sleep, right, because there can be other issues going on of a emotional or psychological nature in which people use other sources, right, to escape, to avoid, to comfort, right, or to self-medicate. So, it's okay, a day in my room, right, or one, but we also want to make sure that we're not moving into the areas of, substance misuse, spending, difficulties, overspending, compulsive spending issues, food, and other means to kind of avoid or medicate. So, I mean, I think it's kind of a fine line, and I think Star's point is to be taken well. We kind of know ourselves, or if other people, our loved ones, are saying, "Hey, listen, you're spending a really lot of time isolating. You're sleeping a lot. You're not able to sleep at night because now maybe my sleep patterns have shifted because now I'm sleeping too much during the day because I can't get myself up in the morning, and I'm spending too much time, in my bed throughout the day, and I'm not going to be able to sleep at night, quite possibly then. Or maybe I'm just sleeping 20 hours out of 24 in a day." If other people are seeing those kinds of changes and differences in, your coping, your patterns of activities, in many ways, again, not just sleep, you want to pay attention to those and see if there might be something else that's there underneath.
Now, and now that you are mentioning, Susan, self-medication, you know, I hear the news, and there was a study that I think it came like 2 weeks ago that was looking at binge drinking or drinking in general, and how during COVID, like people are drinking more alcoholic beverages, to be exact. So how is that also affecting us? When is a drink okay, but when does it become a problem? How do we know, oh my God, I'm having a problem with this now? You know, because I feel like people sometimes think, oh, it's just a drink here and there, and they are not aware that they're getting into a problem.
Well, I mean, that's an excellent question. I think there's no, magical answer of it, but I think when people are using, whether it be any kind of drug or alcohol or behavioral, right, could be behavior as well, to, again, medicate in a regular and consistent way, or to desensitize them from what's going on, then it can always present risks, right? So certainly, many substances, and alcohol being one of the most addictive ones, right, can present a risk because, unfortunately, right, and with a lot of drugs, they affect our brains, right? It's a brain disorder, substance use disorder, right? So it's neurologically things are going to start to shift. It can be a physical, psychological, or both, right? So if we're kind of really depending on those things psychologically, which they're not going to do, because what we know, at least even just alcohol, right, is a depressant. So people think, I'm going to drink and it's going to it may do that, right? The first drink may do that. The second drink may do that. But eventually, if people are misusing these kinds of substances, right, certainly anything that is mind altering, okay, because a lot of things can be mood altering, but something that's mind altering and or addictive, it's going to impact you down the road, maybe not immediately, but if it becomes where I become more dependent on it to avoid what I might be experiencing, or to avoid other difficulties within my life, my relationships, my vocation, my financial and other responsibilities, then we need to look at, okay, there's probably something greater going on there. And where is it coming from? And then where do I need to go to do something about that, to address it? It can be a very slippery slope. Nobody plans on getting into a difficulty with drugs or alcohol or any kind of process disorder. It's something that's a very subtle kind of changes that go on in our brain.
Yeah, that's definitely, go ahead.
I just want to add that, there's some government organizations and associations that have put some guidelines up for what is social drinking and what is, problematic drinking, just to take alcohol as an example. So I typed it in the chat. It's NIDA. Oh, I might have missed an A. But the National Institute of Health has a great kind of informational brochure that people can read through called Rethinking Drinking. If they're having any questions, or they think they might be in the area of moving beyond, kind of use of a substance into misuse. So I think that's a really great resource for folks to have. And, genetically, when men and women process alcohol differently. So men tend to be able to have less effect of alcohol than women do, because we have more water in our bodies and less muscle tissue. So the effect of our age, our gender, when we're drinking, how much we're drinking, what happens when we drink, and what happens when we can't drink. So those kinds of check-ins. And, a lot of people have commented that during the pandemic, liquor stores remained essential agencies, right? Essential storefronts. So are people turning to that more because they're trying to medicate feelings? And certainly different populations like college age kids that are known, or high school age kids are known for binge drinking. And the National Institutes of Health identifies binge drinking as 5 or more alcoholic beverages. And that would be 1 glass of wine, 1 12-ounce can of beer, and 1 4-ounce or 2 ounce of hard liquor. So, you know, again, sometimes people say I only had one drink, but my one drink was, you know, this big, and it was one. So, you know, just kind of being aware of where these other kinds of misuse of alcohol is, but it can be just a guideline to reference if people have some questions or concerns, or somebody's pointing it out to them that they're drinking more than they were aware. And it can just help identify what might be some ways of using some initial controlled measures. And then if somebody isn't able to implement that, it could also mean that there's more going on.
Yeah,
I hope I pulled that right website here. Are you looking at it? Am I sharing my screen? Okay, good. Good.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so let me look at it while we are in it. Susan.
So I think, you know, NIH, Institute of Health, National Institute of Health, or NIDA, start with saying is the Institute of Drug Abuse, National Institute of Drug Abuse. Any of those are wonderful places. And we could, you know, go online and look at a lot of those things. But I think when myself, right, or others also notice that this is, you know, might be exacerbating what's going on for me, because most of us generally know, you know, if we're kind of getting into that slippery slope, right? So and certainly if you're not really sure, you definitely want to check it out. You want to check it out online. You want to check it out with another mental health professional if you need to, or with your even your own family members. It's certainly if others are telling you, right, loved ones, sharing with you concerns they have for your drinking and or their reasoning why, generally there may be something going on. That's where you really would want to look to do a real self-check. Right. The other thing I guess I would want to say is certainly different ages, whether or not we've eaten, you know, and so on, the impact of alcohol or drugs on our systems. But certainly with anyone who has comorbidity, whether those are existing behavioral health or mental health issues, there's a much greater potential or risk if there's abuse of any kinds of drugs or alcohol for a more serious psychological events to occur, or more significant depression. The other thing is if there's any comorbidity medically, right? So if people have medical illness and we, you know, they are, you know, in a consistent way, it's not, if you will, the social drinking, and there are, you know, the how many drinks is social drinking and all this. So you can look at that. But if it's something that's becoming that's going to present its own set of health issues, because there are existing medical issues or existing psychological issues. And if we get into moving through, you know, substance misuse, that kind of comorbidity is probably some of the most dangerous that you can really have when you're caring for, you know, a client with multiple, you know, morbidity like that.
Definitely. And before I continue with questions, this is just a reminder for our attendees, this is your space too. So please start sending your questions. Use the Q&A box or the comments or chat box to send all your questions. This is your opportunity to have two super experts here to answer all your questions. So go ahead and inundate us with questions. Esther, you mentioned 5 drinks. But there are also people that say, oh, well, but I have high tolerance, so I can tolerate 10. And indeed, you know, you see people that drink and drink and drink and don't get drunk. Other people have half a glass of wine and get drunk. So is it about getting drunk? Is it about the number of drinks? Or is it about the behavior that comes with the drinks? Like what is it? What's the problem?
Well, it could be any of those, right? So the 5 drink is just the National Institutes of Health definition of binge drinking. And that was really used to identify, again, those age groups of high school students and college age students, where people were really drinking enormous quantities, right? And sometimes daring each other to drink more and doing these drinking games that cause people to drink more. So those populations are different. But what, the standard of what people would consider a binge might be anything from, 20 plus, so if you can drink that high quantity, it is an indication of high tolerance, which could indicate and be part of a substance use disorder problem. It could be a symptom of that. So high tolerance is something that would, in some ways get our attention to say, how long has somebody been drinking? What are the consequences of drinking? And how does someone feel the next day after a binge might feel a little different? And we look at the connection also to, Sue mentioned alcohol being a depressant as a classification of drugs it is, but it also tremendously impacts anxiety. So during the day of drinking, people often feel relief from their anxiety, and the next day or 2 or 3 or 4, as you mentioned, it affects our brain, it stays with us, and those anxiety levels are typically heightened after getting the relief of drinking in the moment. So we want to look at all of those pieces for people. And you mentioned the elderly, and that actually is a population that has higher, as they are more isolated, risk to increased drinking and medication use and abuse. So it's a population that doesn't get a lot of talking about, but we might need to really check in with our family members, especially as we see them over the holidays. We might see some of these changes.
Now, unfortunately, because we're talking about COVID, and you just mentioned the holidays again, probably there are going to be many tables that don't have the same amount of family members as last year due to COVID losses, and I'm talking about life losses. So any special tips for these families, for these people that might be hurting from that? Also, why don't we talk about, loss of life as well, and how is that handled? To start, Susan? Anyone?
Well, I think generally the holidays, if you've lost a loved one or you have a significant person, right, and who's no longer at the holiday season, it's certainly going to affect us, right? It does usually year after year. You remember the person that's gone. This year, I think there's just more losses that are, certainly because people have been through death. Lost the loved one through illness, the COVID virus itself, the coronavirus, or maybe there's been other losses. I mean, unfortunately, death isn't really stopped, even though we've been 8 months inside of a pandemic. So many people I know have also lost loved ones unrelated to the pandemic, right? So, and again, this is going to affect people. I think that, there are, as best we can, we're going to have to recognize that there's going to be a lot of shifts in our holidays this year anyway. That's going to create its own sense of loss. I think what we want to try to do, at least certainly if there has been actually the physical loss of a loved one, create an opportunity with others, either if you can do it directly in person with family members, if that's not doable, which it may not be because of risk issues or distance issues or travel restrictions, do it in a way that we can, with others as best we can, honor that person's absence, that we can be able to set up some maybe creative way to be able to honor them. Maybe it's an ornament on the tree. Maybe it's some type of memory book that we put together, or we maybe quiz each other about, do you remember grandma's maiden name? Where were they from? We can try to be able to set up creative ways with loved ones to honor that person's loss, and then be able also to recognize with those loved ones, this is sad, and being sad and honoring that grief and that sadness is a very, very important part of grief work. That recognizing people are going to be in different places and stages with their grief, honoring that and accepting that, and then being able to, with others as best we can, help support and provide that safe haven, that safe place for them to talk about those feelings and to honor those losses and the sadness.
Now, start, how can we help people who are grieving? I feel that most of the time when somebody's grieving and crying, the first thing that we say is, oh, don't cry, and I'm always wondering, is that the right thing to say? I mean, if you feel like crying, you gotta cry. And the first thing that we do is like, oh, don't cry. Like, it's gonna be okay. Don't cry, don't cry. And, what do we do? How do we best help somebody? And it's so many people right now, unfortunately. As Susan was saying, it's many more people than in any other years that are going through these, and how can we help them?
Yeah, that is, again, another great question. How can we help? Because that's really our intent by saying, oh, don't cry, is our intent is I want to take away your pain, right? And when I see you cry, I see your pain, and I don't want to see your pain. I don't want to see you in pain. And it kind of comes, I think, out of a really good intentioned place. But often crying is the expression of sadness and loss and love, and a lot of emotion needs, and when we have high emotion as we experience in loss and grief is not pathology. Grief is part of life. But we don't talk about grief. We don't know what to say when somebody is experiencing grief, right? We're afraid to say the wrong thing, so we don't say anything at all. And sometimes we just skip over it. And so there's the concept of there's not really anything that we can say to take away someone's pain, but we can be present and we can validate what they're telling us and what they're showing us. And when we go back to those feelings, right, of feelings are not facts, but they're signals. And sometimes people are afraid to cry as an expression because they think the crying's never going to stop. I think if I start, I'm never going to be able to rein this in. And what we know about feelings is that they're like waves. They come and then they go. And then another one comes and then it comes back. And, we kind of ride it like the ocean. And everybody may grieve differently. Some people don't cry when they lose someone. They don't connect to that feeling, and that's okay too. So there's no right or wrong way to grieve. And there's no right or wrong way to be present with someone who's grieving, who's asking for you to be present with them. We don't have to have the words, we can just be there. Now, can we be in present with people during COVID? This is changing that too. So how might we acknowledge that somebody might be grieving and just say, I'm here if you want to talk, I'm here if you want to scream, I'm here if you want to just be silent. I might send a card, really supporting that person in the best way that they want. And it might change day to day. One day, they don't want to talk about it, next day they might. And I think it comes up for all of us because we've all had varying degrees of loss, and we know people. If we haven't experienced the direct loss of a loved one, we know stories, and there's a lot of loss that we've watched over the news for these many, many months of stories of families that have lost people and multiple members of their families. So it's just heartbreaking, and the best we can do, I think sometimes, is just acknowledge that these feelings represent and are healthy to express and experience and label to help us move through the feelings as they come.
Yes.
The only thing I did want to add is that I think what we want to try to do as well is when we're trying to comfort someone who's bereaved, right? Sometimes we are worried about what's the most perfect thing to say. I usually say to people, there's probably not that many things that are the wrong thing to say, because most of the time people are going to say something generally supportive. Saying, oh, please don't cry, it shows people that you don't want them to be in that pain, as Star indicated. I think sometimes it's helpful, though, if we are in those situations, to try to first reflect on, how is this loss for me? What is going on for me? Because when I'm with that person, I'm going to be the most present when I'm going to be able to connect to what I'm experiencing as well. And the likelihood is, if I'm helping someone who's grieving, I've probably experienced that loss pretty closely as well. I'm comforting them, and certainly maybe it's someone I don't know who they may have lost, but often it's going to be someone we know mutually. So I think being able to recognize I may express my grief differently, and where is my experience right now as well, as I move to try to hold this person through, or contain and support where they are in the moment, what's going on for me, and how do I be as honest about that with myself. Certainly not maybe put that on them, right? I'm trying to comfort them, but recognize that their expression might be different than mine, and I might be in a different place in relation to their experience at that moment.
And we only have like 10 minutes left of this talk, and there is something that we haven't talked about, and it's anger. Like, I feel that a lot of people are feeling more angry now. You know, it's just a tough year to live. You know, COVID, kids are not in school, they're at home. People who are working from home are pressured to stay there. As I was saying, we're losing a lot of freedom. The elections, you know, a lot of people get stressed about that as well. So it's a lot of stressors. So some people get sad, some people get stressed, some people get angry. Any tips to help to manage anger as an expression of everything that is happening? Because I feel anger is not the best way, you know, and we see how many riots are happening also, like in different cities, and all of that is definitely happening. It's present.
Yeah. So anger is another emotion. It's another feeling, and our feelings are our feelings. And we might even have really strong and you know, racial injustice, and there's many subjects that are causing the resurge. And grief also has one of the phases often experienced is anger in the process of grieving. So it's hard to tease out sometimes what feeling belongs with what, but you know, anger as an emotion is another feeling, and sometimes it motivates us to do something positive with it. But because we feel anger, it's not a license to do something that harms someone else. So because I feel this way, I have to manage that feeling and channel it in a more appropriate place, or experience it or express it without giving myself permission to throw a chair across the room, or to come down hard and, you know, be aggressive with someone, either verbally or physically, because I'm feeling angry. And I have a right to feel angry. We have a right to every feeling that we have, including anger. And this is, I think, a harder one for women to acknowledge even than men. But it's a human experience. It's a human feeling. Do you want to add something, Sue?
I guess you know, certainly I think there's anger, but then anger sometimes is built on this frustration and this feeling of a loss of certain amounts of control that people have in their world, right? So you've got this, you know, fatigue and this kinds of level of burnout. So if I'm getting really angry, did it really start with kind of this irritability? Is that coming from, you know, a lack of sleep? Is it coming from maybe I'm really hungry? So kind of trying to weed out what am I, you know, is it just exhaustion? I'm just tired of all this, and I'm really annoyed right now. I'm really, you know, angry. Okay. So certainly we don't want to act necessarily. We want to have kind of coping strategies and other kinds of problem solving, but sometimes that we have in place, right, that we can learn if we don't know them. What are those go-to strategies when I'm really, really angry? Because if I'm really, really angry, I might want to throw the chair across the room, or I might want to yell at my kids, or I might want to, you know, use drugs or alcohol because I'm not able to cope through that. So what do I need to do to develop those skills and those strategies within myself so that I can cope with my anger in a healthy and an adaptive way rather than a maladaptive way? And then the other piece of it would be, what's behind that? Is it that I'm hungry? Is it that I feel mistreated? Is it that I feel unheard? Is it that I feel you know, violated or you know, in some way. It also too, is it because someone's hurt me, right? Or I'm sad. So sometimes, you know, anger can come from a lot of different places. I think when we're able to put our hands a little bit better on what's really going on and look a little bit deeper underneath, because it might not have been that real conversation you had with your spouse. It might have been the other 10 things or the other 2 or 3 things that happened a little bit earlier in your day that might have really thrown a wrench into your emotional state, right? And you're kind of self-regulating throughout the day, and it's really not that one thing. Often it's all the other things that came before it, you know. Sometimes it can be that.
Yeah. So you know, I really could talk to you both for hours and hours. That's my feeling. I'm learning a lot from you. But unfortunately, we only have 5 minutes left. So what are your last thoughts? Susan, any message for our attendees and then all the people that might be watching this video? Like, how do we deal with COVID?
I guess my only thought is, and I know we have some numbers and Stora's going to give them, and great, because we got them, but that people should, you know, stay connected, reach out as best you can, use social and self-help supports, use telehealth services, and then be able to please know, right, that there are these services. Utilize them as you need to, utilize those that other loved ones as you're able to, and that you're not alone, right? So these supportive services are there, they're in place, and we're really all together in this. So it's not easy. One of the hardest things, I think, is that first call. Even when people are making the first call to us here, we want to acknowledge that, and we're really actually very, very sincerely grateful that they're doing that. So it takes a lot of courage. It's not always a comfortable thing to do, but recognize we're not alone, and it is okay to ask for help, and the help is in place.
What will be your take-home message to start? And thank you for writing all of these. So let me just read it. So you're sharing with us New York State NYS Emotional Support Helpline at 844-863-9314, and the Suicide Prevention Lifeline 800-273-TALK, or text HOME, HOME, to 741741. These are definitely great resources. I'm sure the people here, one of our attendees, will be able to use this. Another one, a website, Psychology Today. Oh yeah, that's true, I like that website. Psychology Today has lots of free articles on topics like this for future info. Okay, Star, any last words for our attendees? And myself, I'm learning.
Yeah, I think we want to just remember that gratitude at this time of year and service and how to pay it forward. If we're really, really struggling, we can reach out for help for therapy. There's psychologists and social workers that are great resources to help people through emotional, distressing times. And Psychology Today has a find a therapist feature. You can put your insurance information in there. You can put your topics that you would like to address with someone in there, and it will pull up some resources of names for you for that one-on-one. And I think that, you know, when we are at our, you know, kind of our lowest, sometimes that is the key to sort of look for someone else we can help. And that can be something that can change those inner feelings and negative self-talk to give to someone else who might be in need, or to a topic or a foundation that speaks to us, that means something to us. And that can really help ground us in our own values while we're dealing with all of these changes and losses, as you mentioned.
So I'm really gonna steal Marlene's words here, one of our attendees, because, you know, we have 1 minute left, and she put down Thank you for a great discussion on a very important topic. It was really helpful to hear some of your recommendations and tips, and good to know we're not alone in what we are all going through. I think she just put it so beautifully. I have to steal her words.
Thank
but
you.
Really, it's been great having you. I'm going to invite you again because I want to talk to you forever and ever. And thank you to our attendees for being with us today. Next week, we have a packed day of diabetes education because it's Diabetes Month. So we're gonna be here from 8 to 3 in the afternoon with different diabetes experts talking about anything and everything. So if you have diabetes or know somebody with diabetes who would like to learn more about diabetes, please join us a week from now. And then we have other events going on throughout the month. So thank you for joining us today. Star, Sue, you're amazing.
Our pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you, Sandra.
And
our pleasure.
We'll meet soon. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody. Bye.
Bye, everyone.